Now please welcome for live Q&A, Greg Mankiw from Harvard University. The first question in the chat is, what are some of your idiosyncrasies that you tap down, and when do you get to them in your course?
Well, like most people, I have some political views. I used to be a Republican. Donald Trump solved that problem. But I have probably right of center political views still, despite the fact that I've registered as an independent rather than as a Republican since Donald Trump. But I have right of center political views. I try to avoid putting my politics into my textbook. So I really hope that when students read it, they don't really know what my views are, and that's sort of true throughout my teaching. I often teach a freshman seminar, and the students at the end often say, well, Professor Mankiw, you haven't expressed your position on these things. I mean, we have a lot of in-class debates, and students are presenting different views, and I view myself as the moderator, and I really try to avoid taking sides. And the most common complaint at the end is they want to know what I think. And usually at the very end, like the last class, if you really want to know what I think about something, let me know. I'll tell you now. The class is over. But during the class, I don't want my ideology to be on display. I really say that this is what the profession thinks. This is how economists think. I'm there to be the ambassador for the economics profession.
And people are responding to you saying about nerding out. And so what are some of the models that you have the students, flex their modeling muscles, and how do you try to nerd out later in the class?
Well, I think a lot of the models we can do in intermediate macro are really cool models from modeling standpoint. I mean, I mentioned the solo growth model in the talk. I really love the solo growth model. And I actually made it more prominent when I started teaching intermediate macro than when I was a student taking intermediate macro. So I spend more time thinking about long run growth. But even sort of the older models, things like the ISLM model, the Mundell-Fleming model, these are kind of cool models. They're usually too hard to be taught at the principles level. So the students are usually going to see them for the first time at the intermediate level. It's a lot of moving parts. How does the ISLM model relate to the Keynesian cross, theory of liquidity preference, aggregate demand, aggregate supply? But I think they all kind of fit together pretty well as an intellectual framework. But I don't think it's really at the intermediate level where students can see how all these different pieces fit together. And at the end, they should find it intellectually satisfying as well as a useful tool for understanding the world once they sort of see how, in fact, the superstructure we're developing over multiple chapters, over many lectures, really does kind of fit together in a coherent whole.
So we have a question of which intermediate macro concepts do you think are most important to managerial econ MBA students?
Well, that's a great question. I think most people who go into business aren't going to be controlling the macroeconomy, but they will be thinking about the macroeconomy. And so understanding things like, what does the Federal Reserve do, and what is its role in the economy is very important. I don't think they're going to actually literally control monetary policy. They're not, some of them might, but most of them won't. But I think understanding the broader context in which their organization is running is very useful.
And here's someone asking about a recent New York Times article advocating to pay people to take the COVID-19 vaccine. How would you go about teaching that in your intermediate macro course?
Oh yeah, well, it's funny. I always think of that as more of a micro concept than a macro concept. It's really all about externalities. And I think the whole COVID situation has brought up a lot of interesting topics in both micro and macro. How do we model this particular recession from a macro context? What interventions do we want? I had this article in the New York Times actually advertising the idea from Bob Lighton, a Brookings economist. I was just trying to give him. I thought he had a great idea. Bob Lighton did it, and that we should pay people to take the vaccine, given that there's so many anti-vaxxers out there. So I just wanted to give it some publicity. I think the main argument there is basically an externalities argument. To internalize the externality and get people to sort of to bear the full benefits of the vaccine. And if they think they're not benefiting because they're an anti-vaxxer, they might think they're benefiting if they're getting $1,000. They may not be a hardcore anti-vaxxer. You can overcome it with $1,000 per person. So that was basically a micro concept. But there are lots of macro issues rising here. This was. I think of this particular recession as being both a major shift in supply and demand. Basically, when we're telling people you can't go to your favorite restaurant, and you're telling waiters, I'm sorry, your restaurant you worked at is closed, you're basically shifting both the demand for restaurant services and the supply of restaurant services simultaneously. And that's how, actually, the new edition of my macro book that's coming out will also has a section of modeling the COVID recession from that perspective.
So speaking of modeling those, what policy discussions that are happening today are best suited to be covered in the intermediate macro course?
Oh, I think a lot of the discussion of the response to the COVID recession can be talked about. And I think trying to figure out what the goals are. The goals here are a little different from most recessions. One thing that makes this recession different is it is a recession by design. And by that I mean, given that we have this pandemic, policymakers said we really want output and employment to fall temporarily to stop the spread of the virus. Normally, when we go into recession, it's like, oh, something happened accidentally we didn't anticipate. Think of like 2008, and we'd like to put people back to work as quickly as possible. During this downturn, at least initially, the goal was not to put people back to work as quickly as possible. We wanted people to stay home. So it was very much of an intentional recession rather than an accidental recession. As a result, the policy response wasn't aimed necessarily at stimulating the economy, getting back to full employment. It was helping people overcome this difficult time. So it was more the nature of disaster relief than it was in macroeconomic stimulus. And I think that was the motivation of, for example, paying people much more in unemployment insurance than we normally do in an economic downturn. Normally we worry that, oh, unemployment insurance that's excessive is going to induce people not to go back to work. Well, we were telling them to go back to work in the middle of when this was at its peak. So having what seemed like very high unemployment insurance was probably the right thing to do at the time.
And I'm seeing a question that a lot of the real world examples right now are, of course, tied to COVID. Are there good non-COVID real life examples that you are bringing into your course at the moment?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a discussion of trade policy, and Donald Trump was elected talking a lot about trade policy, and he was talking a lot about, gosh, we need to induce trade policy in order to reduce the trade deficit. So understanding the basic forces governing a trade deficit, and how the trade deficit relates to capital flows, and how things like tariffs affect or don't affect trade deficits. I mean, not as much as Donald Trump thinks they do. I think that's a very sort of useful idea. So the whole sort of macroeconomics of trade deficits, I think, looms large. In particular, President Trump has often pointed to bilateral trade deficits. And I have a section that's been in the book for quite a while talking about how most economists think that bilateral trade deficits between two countries is not a particularly useful economic concept, because what really matters is our trade deficit with the rest of the world, not our trade deficit country by country. So that the economics there hasn't changed, but the salience of it has increased substantially during the Trump administration.
Here's one. Do you think that all economic choices are also political choices, and it is time to be honest about the shortcomings of the system and reveal how it works or it doesn't work? So are all economic choices political choices, and should we be honest if that is the case?
Well, ultimately, economists don't rule the world. I mean, sometimes they give us a little bit of power. I mean, the Federal Reserve was created as a quasi-independent institution staffed by people with a lot of economic expertise. And so they try to take some of the politics out of it. But ultimately, it's only because the political system granted the Federal Reserve some independence that it has that independence. Ultimately, in a democracy, the economic policy choices are going to rely on our political leaders to choose and implement. And our goal as economists is to try to educate people. To some extent, that's educating the leaders. I spent 2 years work as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and my role was purely advisory. I have no power as the chairman of the CEA. I was just giving advice. But really, I think it's less important to educate the leaders than it is to educate the voters, because ultimately our leaders are following the voters. We call them leaders, but they really are our elected followers. They're doing what the voters want them to do. And so the best way to get better economic policy, I've long believed, is to educate voters so they understand better economic policy. what we do in the classroom, teaching introductory and intermediate level microeconomics and macroeconomics, is tremendously important because we are teaching the voters of the future, and those voters of the future are going to ultimately determine the kinds of economic policies we have.
We have a teaching question here. Do you ever teach search theory in intermediate?
I've thought about that. In my chapter on unemployment, there is it starts off by talking about job losing and job finding and the rate of job loss and job finding determining the steady state level of unemployment. That's sort of the beginnings of search theory. I've thought about how to incorporate a little more at search theory, in particular something like the Diamond Martin Sorides model, which is very much the sort of the center of macro labor these days. I've yet to find a simplified enough version of search theory that I feel like it wouldn't overwhelm a typical sophomore. If somebody has somebody out there has a version of that for me to consider for a future edition, please send it to me. I'd love to see it. I have read some articles. I'm saying, okay, can I simplify this DMP search theory model so that it's not more mathematically complicated than, say, the solo growth model or the ISLM model? I haven't seen a version that I think I could pedagogically introduce at this level, but I understand the motivation, and I'm tempted to try it every edition, and maybe I will at some point in the future. Somebody sends me a good way to do it.
All right, James, send the good idea. Here's one of talk a little bit about minimum wage. When all factors are taken into consideration, does minimum wage help or hurt an economy?
Well, I think there's a big debate about the impact of the minimum wage. I've not participated in that literature, but I've read it, and it does seem like this very smart economists on both sides. David Carter thinks the effects are quite minimal, the adverse effects are minimal, whereas someone like David Newmark thinks they're much larger. The way I think of it is, okay, well, what's the alternative? If we have mixed feelings about the minimum wage as a way of raising the wages of low income people as an alternative, and I think if you say, okay, we're going to choose between the minimum wage on the other hand and an expansion of the earned income tax credit on the other, then I think if you got a bunch of economists in the room, I think you get an overwhelming majority voting for the earned income tax credit. I think politically the minimum wage has more salience than the earned income tax credit, because earned income tax credit sounds really complicated. If you have a typical person who doesn't earn the EITC, what is the EITC? They wouldn't even know probably what the EITC is. Whereas everybody kind of understands the minimum wage. So I think the political science of the minimum wage is large. But I think from a policy standpoint, we have better tools to achieve the same goals as the minimum wage without some of the adverse employment effects.
Well, Greg, Econ Ed is a celebration of economics education. So I was wondering if you have a teacher or a professor that you view as the best teacher of your life, or one who put you on the path to become an econ professor. Who would that teacher be, and can you share a story?
Sure. I'll mention four. There are four people who were the most important in my life, in my path to becoming an economist. And in rough order, they were Harvey Rosen, who I took freshman economics from, Alan Blinder, who I wrote my senior thesis as an undergraduate under, Larry Summers, who I met as a first-year PhD student, and then Stan Fisher, who ultimately advised my dissertation. So those are my four most important economists in my own life. Let me just start off with just mention about Harvey Rosen. Harvey Rosen taught introductory economics, and he was a funny, charismatic, crystal clear teacher, teaching basically I guess it was introductory micro, kind of headed from micro. And he was just so charismatic that he really sort of changed my mind to go from, instead of being a math major, I decided to become an econ major. I went to his office after my freshman year and asked him for a summer job. And he, to my surprise, he gave me one, mainly because I knew a little bit of computer programming. I only had taken introductory econ 101 and 102. So I knew almost no econ at that point, but I had some computer programming. He hired me. I learned so much that summer working for him. I was delighted that later, when President Bush appointed me to become chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, I called up Harvey and said, Harvey, can I come and join me and be my colleague at the Council of Economic Advisors? So we worked together again 30 years later as colleagues after I sat in his freshman course.
That's awesome. Well, Greg Mankiw, thank you for sharing that story, and thank you for joining us to talk about intermediate macro at EconEd this year. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Clay.